There are cars you remember because they were spectacular, and there are cars you remember because they were everywhere. The second type is much harder to achieve. For a car to be ubiquitous, it has to be suitable for everyone. For the doctor and the plumber, for the family of five and the salesman who drives 200 kilometers a day. But there are very few cars in history that have achieved that. The Renault 12 was one of them. It was manufactured in more than 15 countries, on 4 continents, for almost 4 decades. More than 2.5 million units worldwide, not counting those that came from factories with a different name but with the same design underneath. And the strangest thing is that Renault had been preparing to replace it for years. It disappeared in the same way it had lived, without attracting attention. Market by market, year by year, until one day it stopped being manufactured and the assembly line kept moving to do something else. The question isn't why it disappeared. The question is why Renault decided to let a car that was still running die.
Welcome to Autoledger.
In the next few minutes, you'll discover how a project designed to be truly simple became one of Renault's best-selling cars ever. You'll understand why a model that was manufactured in more than 15 countries, on 4 continents, and for almost 4 decades, disappeared without hardly anyone explaining why. And you'll discover that the official reason given for its discontinuation concealed a strategic decision Renault had made long before anyone said it publicly. As is almost always the case in the automotive industry, the replacement arrived before the farewell. It all started in January 1964 when Renault's design department began working on what they internally called Project 117. The brief was clear and modest. The new car had to be economical, not overly sophisticated, with a spacious interior, a generous trunk, and a small engine. It had to be easy to manufacture so it could be produced anywhere in the world. It had to be reliable for export markets and comfortable enough for France. It wasn't a manifesto of cutting-edge engineering. It was a list of requirements designed to make a car that would work everywhere and that anyone could afford. 5 years later, in October 1969, that project arrived at the Paris Motor Show with a much simpler name, Renault 12. The Renault 12 wasn't a car that would make you fall in love at first sight. It didn't have the charisma of the Citroën DS or the presence of the Peugeot 504. It wasn't sporty or aspirational, but it did exactly what it promised, and it did it well for everyone. It was bought by families who needed a large trunk and 5 proper seats. It was bought by salesmen who drove 200 kilometers a day and needed a reliable car. It was bought by taxi drivers looking for smooth, trouble-free comfort. It was bought by the middle class who wanted a decent car without going into lifelong debt. In Spain, it became part of everyday life in a way that few cars achieve. Fasa Renault manufactured it in Valladolid from 1970, and for more than a decade it was one of the most desired cars among the Spanish middle class. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it was exactly what people needed: spacious, economical, durable, and easy to maintain. In Argentina, it went even further. When it arrived in 1971, it was manufactured at the Santa Isabel plant in Cordoba, and it quickly became a part of the country's everyday landscape. It wasn't driven by the rich or the poor in any special way. Everyone drove it. That's something very difficult to achieve for a car, and that was exactly what the Renault 12 was. It wasn't the car you wanted, it was the car you needed, and sometimes that's much more powerful. In the early 70s, the Renault 12 was everywhere. In France, it was the car of choice for the average French family, successfully competing with the Peugeot 304 and the Citroën GS in a fiercely competitive segment. The European press praised its spacious interior, comfort, and fuel efficiency. Renault had hit the jackpot with its formula. But what no one expected was the scale it would reach. The Renault 12 was manufactured at different times in more than 15 countries: France, Spain, Argentina, Turkey, Romania, Colombia, Venezuela, Chile, Mexico, Morocco, Australia, Belgium, Canada, Portugal, and Yugoslavia. It was literally a global car, something almost unprecedented for a mid-range model at that time. In each market, it found its middle-class version. In Colombia, Sofasa manufactured it from 1973, and it dominated sales against the Fiat and the Dodge Polara. In Spain, Fasa produced almost 455,000 units over more than a decade. In Argentina, the number would exceed 444,000 units before production ceased. In 1976, Renault unveiled a refreshed range, new bumpers, a new front end, and a redesigned dashboard. It was a sign of confidence. The brand continued to invest in the model, continued to believe in it. Also a version that almost no one remembers today, the Renault 12 Gordini. With 125 horsepower, it could reach almost 185 kilometers per hour. Truly incredible for a family car in the early 70s. It demonstrated that the platform still had plenty of potential. It seemed like the Renault 12 could handle anything. But there was something that Renault himself knew from the beginning and that nobody said out loud. Project 117 was born with a condition written into the original commission. The car had to be easy to manufacture anywhere in the world. This meant simple mechanical solutions, inexpensive replacement parts, and deliberately restrained technology. It was a strength for developing markets. It was a weakness for the future. Gordini version was launched. Many expected Renault to use the lightweight aluminum engine from the Renault 16 in the standard version of the 12. Technically, it was simple to do. It would have given the car a real advantage in fuel economy and performance. Renault decided against it. The reason was cost. It wasn't an engineering decision, it was a business decision. And that same logic cost over technical ambition that had defined the birth of the Renault 12 in 1964 would also define its end. Only it would be years before that became entirely clear. In 1978, Renault launched the 18. It was the official successor to the 12 in Europe. More modern, better equipped, with more powerful engines. In France, the 12 disappeared from the range in 1980. The European market had spoken and Renault had listened. But this is where the story gets complicated in a way that few expected. Because the Renault 12 didn't disappear when the 18 arrived. It simply withdrew from markets where it was no longer competitive and continued as normal in markets where it was still imported. In Spain, it remained until 1983. In Argentina until 1994. In Turkey until 2000. In Romania, under the Dacia brand until 2004 as a sedan and until 2006 as a station wagon. What was conceived as a car designed to be manufactured anywhere in the world fulfilled that promise exactly, only no one predicted it would do so for almost 4 decades. But there's something that doesn't fit in that peaceful story. If the Renault 12 was so good, so useful, so adaptable, if factories in Argentina and Turkey were still producing it decades after its discontinuation in Europe, why didn't Renault ever seriously update it? Why wasn't there a real second generation? The answer takes us back to 1964, to that list of requirements for Project 117. The Renault 12 wasn't designed to evolve, it was designed to be manufactured, and there's a huge difference between the two. In Argentina, however, Renault did add versions over time. In 1984, the GTS, the top-of-the-line version, appeared featuring twin round headlights and air conditioning. In 1990, the GTL arrived with plastic bumpers, a 5-speed transmission, and a more contemporary look. These were cosmetic and equipment updates, not major transformations. The car underneath remained the 1969 model, and yet it sold. In 1993, while Michael Jackson was escaping from a Buenos Aires shopping mall in a red Renault 12, the car had been in production in Argentina for more than 20 years and was still a real option for thousands of families. That says a lot about what the car was, and it also says a lot about what was happening in the Argentinian market. But the end was approaching, and when it came almost silently without grand announcements or farewells. On November 2, 1994, exactly 23 years after the first one rolled off the assembly line at the Santa Isabel plant, the last one came off the assembly line. Same date, same place. As if someone had deliberately calculated that detail, and with that, the Renault 12 ceased to be manufactured in America. There is an irony in the story of the Renault 12 that sums up better than any number what this car meant to millions of people. In Romania, the version manufactured under license by Dacia had a different name, the Dacia 1300. It was, in essence, the same car. But in a country with very few private mobility options for decades, the Dacia 1300 became something the Renault 12 never was in France or Spain, the only car that existed for an entire generation. When production of the Dacia 1300 ended in 2004, it had been in manufacture for 35 years, more than 1.9 million units. Romanians born in the 1960s, who got married in the 1970s, took their children to school in the 1980s, and taught their grandchildren to drive in the 1990s, all did so in the same car. The same design, the same basic engine, the same car. What Renault had designed to be cheap and easy to manufacture had unintentionally become the deepest emotional bond a car can have with an entire society. Now comes the part that Renault never fully explained in its press releases. The official reason for the end of the Renault 12 in each market was always the same. Better, more modern, more competitive models had arrived. The Renault 18 in Europe, the Renault 9 in Spain, new models in Argentina, in Turkey, emissions regulations. In Romania, the transition to more modern platforms within the group. All of those reasons are true. But there is one question that no one has clearly stated. If the Renault 12 was so adaptable, if it could be manufactured in 15 countries, if it worked in tropical climates and on unpaved roads and in cities and in the countryside, why did Renault never invest in a real second generation? The answer lies in Project 117 in that list of requirements from 1964. The Renault 12 was designed to be cheap to produce, not to be developed. Renault had built an export car intended for markets that were still industrializing, and that decision, which was a huge success in the short term, became the ceiling the model could never overcome. When the markets where the Renault 12 was sold began to mature, demanding more technology, more safety, and more comfort, Renault had two options: invest in a new platform for a car that was no longer sold in Europe, or simply withdraw it and replace it with more modern models. The choice was never difficult. The Renault 12 didn't have a place in the future lineup because it was never designed to have one. It was designed to be useful now in many places, at low cost. And it was for much longer than anyone would have calculated in 1964. What Renault didn't calculate was the emotional bond. The clues had been there from the beginning. The very design principles that made it universal, simple, durable, and cheap to manufacture were also the principles that guaranteed there would never be enough money to reinvent it. The Renault 12 was a victim of the success of its own original design. The end of the Renault 12 did not have a single date or place. It faded away market by market, year by year, over more than 2 decades. First Europe, then Spain, then Argentina, then Turkey. Finally, Romania. There were no grand ceremonies anywhere. In Argentina, the Santa Isabel plant continued working with other models. In Turkey, the Bursa factory switched to producing more modern versions. In Romania, Dacia was gradually absorbed by Renault in the years following the fall of communism and transformed into the affordable car brand it is today. The Renault 12 did not have a last collector's edition. There was no farewell statement. There were no closing ceremonies with the workers signing the body of the last unit. It simply stopped being manufactured one day, and the assembly line kept moving to do something else. That was, in a way, consistent with what it had always been. A car that didn't seek attention, that did its job and left quietly. In 2004, when Dacia ceased production of the last sedan based on the Renault 12 in Romania, it had been on the market for 35 years. The platform, which Renault had designed with the explicit aim of being cheap, simple, and manufacturable anywhere in the world, had fulfilled that promise for longer than any other in the brand's recent history. Well-preserved original examples have steadily increased in value among collectors. The Gordini versions, of which only about 5,188 were ever made, are now museum pieces. Estates and sedans in good condition find buyers throughout Europe and Latin America. And there's more. The invisible legacy of the Renault 12 lives on in today's Dacia. That Romanian brand, which for decades manufactured cars based on the 12's design, became, under Renault's ownership, the brand's commitment to affordable, durable, and inexpensive to maintain cars. The Dacia Logan, launched in 2004, the same year the 1300's production ended, was in many ways the heir to that same philosophy. An unpretentious car designed to function and made affordable for everyone. Project 117 didn't end in 2006. It just changed its name. There's something in this story that says a lot about the automotive industry. Renault designed the Renault 12 with a list of requirements that never included the word legacy. They wanted an economical, robust car that could be manufactured anywhere and was easy to maintain. They didn't want an icon, they weren't planning on a generational symbol. They just wanted a car that would sell well in many markets for a few years. It cost them 37 years. And meanwhile, that same ordinary car that nobody looked at twice, so discreet that a man in Buenos Aires used it to take Michael Jackson out of a parking lot without almost anyone noticing, that car continues to appear in the memories of millions of families on 4 continents as the first car they had, the car of the first long trip, the car with which they learned to drive. That wasn't in Project 117. It just happened. If you found this interesting, I'll leave another video on screen that I'm sure will surprise you.